Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I am your host, Dane Waters. It's great to be here again today. It's always a pleasure to be here, to be able to talk about things that are happening around the world. So let's just take a quick little gander around the world before we get to our guest today. In the United States, there's a lot going on, as always. I'm an American. I need to talk about the United States. And I think we're quickly heading to a showdown with the U.S. Supreme Court because Donald Trump has tried to make his economic future, America's economic future, around tariffs. The courts at the lower level have said that tariffs are illegal and can't do it. So now it's before the U.S. Supreme Court. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if the U.S. Supreme Court says that the president cannot impose tariffs. What happens? I think it will send a message around the world that the president does not have the power he thinks he has. Now, whether that's good or bad just depends on the country. But economically, the U.S. Treasury is going to have to pay back billions and billions and billions of dollars to try to help people understand or to compensate these companies that were dealing with the tariffs. So that's number one. So we'll see what happens there. There's also the Epstein files that are coming out now with the U.S. Congress. They're actually showing things of letters that Donald Trump and books that Donald Trump gave to Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender, and Donald Trump says he didn't write it, so we'll see how that comes out. But even around the world, we have a new prime minister in Thailand because the previous prime minister just a few weeks ago was kicked out because she was having a phone call with a former general in Cambodia. So it's interesting there how Thailand's going to, kind of recover from all the scandals that are there. Russia-Ukraine war is getting worse than ever was. It's just, just so much going on around the world. It's just hard to see how. I'd love to report on something positive, other than my favorite tennis player Alcaraz beat Sinner in the U.S. Open. So that's the positive thing, in my opinion. So anyway, so let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back to our guest to talk about things that are way more important than my monologue. Thanks a lot. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. So today, I'm in Japan, and when you come to Japan, it's a very sobering experience. I went down to Hiroshima, where saw the remnants of what the first nuclear blast around the world, the problems that it caused. But also here in Japan, speaking of prime ministers, the prime minister here has stated that he's going to be resigning. And so we're going to see a change in government in Japan. So we're seeing around the world a lot of changes within governments. And today, fortuitously for us, actually, I would like to say fortuitously. However, my guest, Dr. Theo Zenou, decided to talk last week about France and what's going to happen to France. I think he's a soothsayer because, look, the government in France is falling. So, Doctor, how are you today? Great to be here. Thanks for
Wonderful.
having me. I'm sitting here saying thanks for having me. What am I doing? I'm just losing my mind. It's a jet lag, I
Thanks for
guess. I
having
don't know
me.
what's going on. So let's talk about what's happening in France. Uh, Give us kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version.
Back to the last presidential election in 2022. France, like the US, is a presidential system. The winner of the last election was Emmanuel Macron. He got elected for a 5-year term until 2027. The president gets elected. It's not like in the UK where a party gets into parliament and then they appoint a prime minister. It's a presidential system. However, once Macron was elected, they had what they call legislative election, parliamentary elections. And the result was a hung parliament. There was no majority. Macron was able to cobble together a minority government of the center left, the center, and the center right to support his centrist, liberal, pro business agenda. However, a couple of years in, they had EU elections last year, and Macron's party suffered terribly. And the winner of the election, the resounding winner, was a National Rally, which is a traditional far-right party in France of Marine Le Pen. And on a whim, Macron decided to dissolve the parliament and to call for new parliamentary elections, saying this parliament is no longer legitimate. It's clear that the French people have moved on, and we're going to have a new parliament to represent public opinion today. He was hoping that by pressuring the French people and saying, look, the national rally at the gates of power, they would come together and support his kind of Republican front. Except that didn't quite happen. They had the election, and now they had an even more divided parliament between three blocks: a leftist bloc, a far-right bloc, and then a smaller centrist bloc. So this election didn't solve any issue, it only created more. Macron again managed to cobble a minority government, but this time even weaker than the one before, in the center. The first prime minister lasted 3 months. Then he managed to cobble yet another centrist minority government with a former prime minister François Bayrou. This one lasted 8 months and fell last night because Bayrou called for a vote of confidence, and the overwhelming majority of parliament on the left, on the far right, but also amongst the right and center left, refused to give him that confidence. Now, political instability is bad at any time for a country because it means you can't pass laws, you can't govern, you can't pass reforms. It's even worse now because France is in a debt crisis. The French state spends a lot of money and therefore owes a lot of money to people. The French debt, I have the number here, is about 115% of the GDP. Now that's below America, which is 125%, but America, has the dollar as a reserve currency. That's not the case of France. It's one of the most indebted countries in the Eurozone and in the world, but even more importantly than that, its annual budget has a 5% deficit. And the EU wants countries to only have a 3% deficit, so it's way above what it should have. And every year, the French state spends 60 billion euros in interest to service its debt, and that's the biggest single spending item in the French annual budget. And it's only going to grow and grow if things stay the same. So the new prime minister, whoever he is, will need to make big spending cuts to try and balance the book and create a more prosperous future for the French economy. Otherwise, it will become more and more expensive for France to borrow, so they won't be able to borrow, and the state will slowly crumble.
Okay, well let's just break this down. So I agree. Well, once again, in America, we have, I don't think, what is it, like $39 trillion in debt, some crazy number, and I think, but for some reason, people in America think it's okay to have that much debt. But I agree, it's not a country like France just can't handle that kind of debt. But let's go back to the basic political reality. Okay, they got debt, they got to deal with it. Economic reforms they need. Why? Help me understand why the world should care if France's government falls.
Well, because France is, despite everything, still, maybe not for long, but still a major power on the world stage. It's the second biggest economy in the European Union. It's one of the political leaders of the European Union when it comes to foreign policy. French economy is connected to the global economy. So if France is not doing well, or if France is unstable, that can have a ripple effect, not just across Europe, but also across the West and really across the world. Specifically, something that you care about, Dane, is the war in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. Well, along with Germany in the EU, France is one of the steadfast supporters of Ukraine. It gives money to Ukraine, but it also gives diplomatic support to Ukraine. If France is unstable, if there is no government, if Macron is distracted, then that means they're less able to do that. Or even if they try to do that, it means people take them a lot less seriously. And that's true of any number of diplomatic initiatives France might do. France is recognizing the state of Palestine. But it's very easy to delegitimize France now and say, well, you can't even get your own house in order. So why do you even try and make these big diplomatic statements?
Yeah. Well, no, I agree. See, this is something I'd like the audience to understand is that, okay, so we talk all the time on the show about the lack of true leaders and leadership around the world. Leadership among the good guys, as I define the good guys, versus the evils. Um, Merkel's gone out of Germany, so now we get Merz and trying to figure out. I mean, he seems like a good leader, but doesn't have the clout that a Merkel had. So if you look at the European Union or the world, Macron has really been by the way, not that I'm a huge Macron fan, to be very clear about that, but he has been a stable force. We have Starmer in the UK, but they're having their own issues as well with their deputy prime minister resigning. So the stability of France is very critical, as you say, in trying to stop evil, trying to stop Russia, trying to stop China, trying to stop North Korea. And so if Macron's government falls, then the world, it's not just about France. This is how people need to understand. Look at this. It's like an interlocking, it's like Legos, where if you don't have one right Lego piece, then you can't build the whole thing. So democracy is like a Lego, where it must fit together, and if it doesn't, then the world is really in a bad shape. And this is why Macron is so important, regardless of his personality and how he acts. So let's talk about so what happens next? I mean, I know that this is like the fourth prime minister in 9 months that they've had. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so, and this is, as far as France is concerned, this type of instability is not normal.
No, because the French system, since it is a presidential system, is actually predicated on stability. Since the founding of the Fifth Republic in the late 50s by someone called Charles de Gaulle, which I'm sure you viewers will have heard of.
A great airport. It's a great
A
airport.
airport in Paris, named after a great leader, with if you say, the founding father of the modern French Republic, which is the Fifth Republic. It's meant to be, the president has a lot more powers than even in America. And since there is only one legislative election, which comes shortly after the president is elected, the president usually gets the majority of the parliament, and then that's it. For 5 years, they have the parliament. They can do whatever they want. In Macron's case,
But-
he didn't get that.
Well, but also, so let's talk about also, you talk about the um, different political parties or different political elements in the country. Well, let's talk about Marie Le Pen, and why, in my opinion, be very clear, why this has been, and to me, it's benefiting her party, and why should the world be concerned if Marie Le Pen and her party is benefiting from this?
So it's definitely benefiting Marine Le Pen. In fact, she voted last night against the current government, for the current government to be toppled. Marine Le Pen is a daughter of someone who was named Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's passed away now, but was um, essentially a racist, anti-Semitic, um, xenophobic politician in the 50s and 60s and 70s. We started the National Front, now the National Rally. And it's a very dangerous party. It's a party that would divide French people based on their national origin. It's a party that is very sympathetic to Russia on the international stage. It's a party that would favor police repression. It's a party that, in many ways, is part of this global nationalist populist reaction that we've seen over the last decade. And if they got control of the French state, they could wreak a lot of havoc not only in France, but again across Europe. And the very integrity of Europe as a liberal bloc dedicated to the free world, dedicated to protecting and advancing democratic causes, I think will be in danger. Um,
Well, I think that's what we need to get across is because once again we have very limited leaders in the world that believe in freedom and democracy. You have a president of the United States that never speaks about freedom or democracy. And by the way, as a side note, he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I'd like to see how the president is going to win a Nobel Peace Prize when he creates the Department of War, advocating war. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation about, whether it was appropriate to rename it the Department of War versus the Department of Defense. But but you look at America where you have that instability globally, and then you look at once again, Starmer in the UK is having issues, and next week we'll be talking about that. And then you look at, Germany, which I have very serious concerns about Germany to begin with, even though they've been very strong in Ukraine, but you never know. There's, the far right in Germany is making strides as well. And so when we talk about the far right, we have to talk about, you were very kind in how you presented it. But the far right, basically, in my opinion, once again speaking clearly from my opinion, the far right is about as close to, Adolf Hitler's, Nazism as there could be anywhere in the world. And and so what we see is if Europe continues to head in that direction, whether it's in Germany or whether it's with Marine Le Pen in France, we're heading toward a Europe that is in the basically a lot like what Hitler had proposed, and which led to World War II, which is, we all understand that history. Would you agree that if Macron falls and Marie Le Pen takes over, would you agree that we're heading closer to what we experienced with Adolf Hitler in World War II?
Well, we're certainly heading much closer to a version of a French authoritarian system, uh, or at least a French fascist system. Again, Marine Le Pen's party goes back in the 50s and was funded by people who collaborated with the Nazis during the French Vichy.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. We just had like a little glitch there. I apologize for that. So the reason I want to talk to, for the audience, the reason I'm kind of trying to walk through this so slowly about France is Marie Le Pen is that it's important. I mean, most people think, that it's internal elections. Every country has its own issues. Why should France? Why should we really care about France? But this is what, to me, we need to get across is that if Macron loses, if Macron for some reason is he won't be kicked out, but if elections are held and Marie Le Pen and her party takes over, we live in a world now where we don't have strong leaders. Number one, strong leaders that believe in freedom and democracy. That's important to say. And you have the United States, which is pulling back from supporting Europe and supporting Ukraine and supporting freedom and democracy. Trump says all the time Europe should take a more active role in handling the issues that are taking place in Europe. That is fine as long as you have leaders like Macron in France, Starmer in the UK, and Merz in Germany, some others as well, of course. But those are the primary strong leaders. If France becomes an authoritarian state under Marine Le Pen, that stability is gone, in my opinion. So, so this is why, and maybe I'm not saying as eloquently as I should, Theo, but this is why we need to convince the world and the audience that what's happening in France is not just about an internal political issue. It has global implications. Would you agree with that?
Completely has global implication. It has economic implications, but even more importantly, as you say, it has political and geopolitical implication. Concretely speaking, to come back to your point, what happens next? So Macron is still president. He was elected. His term goes until 2027. Unless he decides to resign and he's ruled that out, he will be in office until 2027. Nothing can be done to remove him from that. It's not like in the UK where Prime Minister can be toppled by Parliament. That's not the case in France. He was elected by the French people and he will remain in post. However, he now faces a decision. Does he try yet again to put together a government with the current parliament. But the options are squeezing. You could try now more of a center-left government, when the previous one was more of a center-right government. But lo and behold, this is not going to be some, silver bullet. And even if he does manage to put together a new government, as he says he will now, it might not last very long. The other option would be to go back and have new parliamentary elections, to have again a new parliament. The problem with that according to polls, if you were to do that, Marine Le Pen's party would have an even better score and could potentially have, if not an outright majority, at least a relative majority, which means he would have no choice but to appoint the next prime minister from her ranks. That is something he obviously wants to avoid for the reasons you've outlined. Although he would still be president, would have the final say on foreign policy and diplomacy, to even have a party like the National Rally in government would represent a big bank in French politics and would have repercussion across Europe. So he really doesn't have great options at the moment. We can only hope he managed to find some stability in the new coalition.
Well, in addition, even though there's no stability, we're uncertain what happens. But for the global audience, and especially for Nigeria and Africans, there's been this big thing about France has been pulling out of West Africa. They're pulling troops out of West Africa, things of this nature. If France has been abandoning their responsibility in Africa under Macron, which I can argue that they have, and I can pretty much guarantee that under Marine Le Pen, that Africa will suffer in so many ways. Would you agree with that?
She doesn't care about Africa. If she's elected in 2027, one of her key policies is to cut foreign aid, a lot of it which goes to African countries. She's sympathetic to Russia. She's very happy to let Russia wreak havoc across Africa. She's focused on France. She's focused inwards. She's a nationalist. And that's the danger of nationalism, that you stop caring about the world and then you impose a repressive agenda on your country and you separate real French people against people that you deem are not French enough. In this sense, she's a very, very dangerous politician. It would be dangerous if she became prime minister. If someone from a party became prime minister now, it would be even more dangerous if they reach a presidency.
Well, and that's what once again, we need to make sure the audience understands as well, is that every major government around the world is interrelated to the future of the world. It really is. That's number one. I keep saying number one, number two. I can actually count to three, but after that, I haven't convinced the audience I can count higher than that. But that is where we need to understand is that the United States has pulled out their foreign aid around the world, especially in Africa. If France decides to diminish their foreign aid throughout Africa as well, what happens then? The backfilling already that you see is with China coming in to backfill. And so when France pulls out, then that's going to be more China intervention, more Russian intervention, which means the world is going to be even more divided up between the good versus evil, where the bad guys, once again, the Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, are going to be taking a greater control of countries like Nigeria. And this is the importance of what we're talking about. Well, Theo, you're going to be my guest for the next segment as well, because I want to parlay this into something even more emotional to talk about, nuclear weapons. So let's take a quick break from Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll be back to talk about that. Thank you. To Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters, and I'm here in Hiroshima, Japan, as you can see behind me. Many of you guys have seen that, I'm sure, when you see history lessons about the bombing of Hiroshima, which is where the first atomic bomb exploded. It's very sobering when you sit here and you think about it. I just finished going through the museum. You think about over 140,000 people died within 1945 because of the bombing, and since then it's been a total of close to 500,000 because of radiation and other impacts of the bombing. We talk about the use of nuclear weapons.
Um, this is what we have to remember. We have to remember the fact that nuclear weapons don't need to exist. Now, they are a deterrence. I mean, if you look at the United States has it, the UK has it, France has it, European Union, other countries within the European Union have it, and those are a deterrent. But then you look at what happens when I consider, we talk about evil countries having it. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. This is why the war can't end in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, is because of the threat of Putin using nuclear weapons. So in the hands of bad people or evil people, nuclear weapons are horrific, and they are used to perpetuate evil. And even in the hands of those countries that are good, just the threat of them is just something that we as a country and the world should not tolerate. So I'm going to take a second here. Let's just think about the impact of this, and then I actually am going to ask a question of a couple of Americans what they think about this. Thank you.
What we've always maintained is that the never Trump. I'll bring it down to
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. As you saw just before this break, it was a quick little video of from me in Hiroshima. Once again, I can't express the feeling it is when you actually stand at a location where the first atomic bomb dropped, and just knowing that literally it evaporated people, and it just, the sheer magnitude of that destructive force is something that's very sobering. And if you go there and you don't recognize it or don't feel it, then no, I would have to say there's something wrong with you. So let's take this, Theo. Nuclear weapons. We talk about France. Once again, this is like Legos and dominoes and trying to fit the pieces together, because we live in a world where nuclear weapons are a deterrent. France is a nuclear power. Okay. Currently the nuclear weapons are in the hands of somebody that we would argue, the world would argue, is not going to use them for nefarious means. But then you talk about the possibility of Macron's government falling, and we talk about the possibility of the far right taking over. Giving the far right control of nuclear weapons in France is, to me, the same as giving the KKK in the United States, access to nuclear weapons in the United States. I know that maybe, my audience may get upset with that, and people may think it's too extreme, but this is where we're going. This is why we have to understand politically who leads a country, especially nuclear power, is very important. Does it concern you, before we talk more specifically about nuclear weapons, does it concern you that somebody like Marie Le Pen could have control of a nuclear stockpile?
It's not my primary concern, but it's certainly further down the list as far as our presidency is concerned. It concerns me that anyone has nuclear weapons, but as you say, let alone that more nefarious actors do.
Well, so let's just take, when I was there in Hiroshima, I actually ran across a couple of young Americans. And let's just hear real quick what they were saying when we were talking about nuclear weapons, if they could play those pieces real quick.
Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters, and I'm here in Hiroshima, and I'm just ran into two Americans, and I just wanted to ask their opinions, and I'll ask each one of them a question. Let's first start here. How are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well.
So you're from America, right?
Yes.
So what's your initial feeling like being here? What do you think?
It's very peaceful in the wake of the destruction that has happened here historically. I think that there's this atmosphere of peace and forgiveness moving forward and kind of rebuilding, coming together, unity.
positive, do you think that, let me just ask you a quick question. Do you think nuclear weapons should exist?
No, not at all.
So in your generation, the younger generation, do you feel that the younger generation should band together to ensure that the world is free of nuclear weapons?
100%.
Thank you, sir. Here we are back again with another American that I found here. So Mace is your name, I believe. Mason is your name. So tell us, let me just ask you a quick question like I asked the previous individual. Do you think nuclear weapons should exist?
I think nuclear weapons should not exist, and I think the world should be a peaceful place without war. But, the way that the world is run and everything like that, it's like, everyone is so greedy that no one just wants to come together and, be in harmony, I don't understand why, you can't just, love your neighbor. If everyone just loves each other, the world would just be a better place. But there's all these greedy people in the world, and they just want more and more and take and take.
Listen, I absolutely agree with you. I do think that one of the problems, the reason there's been war and conflict around the world for generations and centuries, is because of the greediness of individuals for land or for money or for profit or whatever. So as the previous guest I was talking to, do you believe that the youth of the world, the young people like you, should band together to try to rid the world of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that the youth needs to rise up and, show the elder generation that, we could all work together and we don't need to have so much conflict.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Enjoy your trip.
Thank you.
There you are. There is hope for the youth of the world, because they actually, the millennials are actually agreeing with something I believe in. So let me ask you, Theo, because you are one of these guys who actually knows so much about so many different things. Nuclear power, not nuclear power, nuclear weapons. How do you feel about them?
I'm every bit as concerned as your guest and as you. I hope we can achieve a nuclear weapons-free future, and I believe that it remains one of the elusive goals of international diplomacy to get rid of all nuclear weapons. What I observe is that during the Cold War, as countries like the US and Soviet Union were, stockpiling nuclear weapons, they were also engaging in nuclear non-proliferation treaties, they were engaging in talks, they were talking about disarmament. It was still seen as a goal in and of itself. Someone like President John F. Kennedy, for instance, very much wanted to move in that direction. Someone like Nikita Khrushchev, his Soviet counterpart, agreed. They started to ban nuclear tests in the atmosphere, but they had a vision that went beyond. Later on, someone like Ronald Reagan was a Republican, more hawkish, also was afraid of nuclear war and also believed that nuclear weapons ultimately should not exist, and came very close with Gorbachev to making such a deal. What saddens me today is that it's not even on the agenda. No one talks about it. It's not even an ideal that we profess to have as a global community. So we've lost something. We've gone back.
Well, no, I agree, and this is where you think about this. One of the reasons that the war with Ukraine isn't over, and people haven't been able to push Putin out of Ukraine, is because Russia, possesses nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were originally created by the Americans as a deterrent, as a way to end the war, as a way to deter the evil. But as evil countries have gained access to nuclear weapons, where do you draw this line? I mean, how do you stop, China from doing what they're going to do against Taiwan, or just in the South China Sea? How do you stop Russia with nuclear weapons? How can you kick them out? So you have the good guys. You have, France has nuclear weapons, UK has nuclear weapons, Germany has nuclear weapons, yet they can't use them. They're no longer a deterrent against what's happening in Europe. So, and Putin has never honored, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Putin has never honored any any agreement made about nuclear weapons. He never has. So what do you think we do, Theo, about nuclear weapons? I mean, what is the next step? If we have leaders that are unwilling to negotiate about them, as you were just talking about, what is the next course of action?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure there is really one. The other danger of nuclear weapon, as you point out, is aggressive regimes like Russia or China can use them as blackmail to get away with whatever they're doing. So they're saying, well, yes, I've invaded Ukraine, but if you push back too much against me, or if I assess that you defend yourself too much, then I'll start using nuclear weapons. Iran wants nuclear weapons to be able to do the same thing over the Middle East and to Israel. If the Western nations disarmed and got rid of their nuclear weapons, I don't think Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping would do that. And that's the crux of the matter, is that unless we actually have an international community and we have trust amongst the nations of the world, and we all agree that this is a key issue, and we all do it together, it can never be done. Because the world would be even more dangerous if America or France didn't have nukes, but Russia and China did.
Oh, exactly. And this
Right?
is where, like the youth we were just talking to, after I interviewed them on camera, I spoke to them privately, and they said, "Why doesn't America just get rid of its nuclear weapons?" Well, okay, let's think about that. Let's dissect what you just said. If America gets rid of their nuclear weapons, and Russia and China does not, and North Korea, which, by the way, people claim has 50 access to 50 nuclear weapons, what do you think they're going to do? Who's going to stop them? Because they are going to have the power in the world to do whatever they want to do. So it is a sad situation where, like, if I were president tomorrow, I would want to get rid of nuclear weapons. But how can I justify getting rid of nuclear weapons if all the bad guys still have nuclear weapons? It's like living in a neighborhood. Let's break it down this way. It's like living in the neighborhood where you have weapons and guns, and you have a very nice home, and the only reason people aren't invading your home is because you have those guns, and because your next door neighbor has guns. If you get rid of them, what is the deterrent to keep people from stealing everything you have and taking it? So that is the logic. But I will tell you, I've always been opposed to nuclear weapons. I just personally have. But when you come here, it is really is a life-changing experience when you actually come here and you go into the museum in Hiroshima and you see the literal devastation, and you see literally on the steps of buildings where the blast was so intense and hot that people evaporated, and you just see the shadows on these steps. And then that was, in 1945 when the bomb dropped, 140,000 people died. But over the generations, almost 500,000 people have died because of the impact of the radiation. It's just heinous. And we cannot live in a world with nuclear weapons. Because the other thing is, as we're seeing, we don't live in a world where everyone does what's right. So, there you're there in the UK. The UK has nuclear weapons, right? Do you think a country like the UK, do you think France, do you think that they should de-arm as well? Or do you think that them possessing nuclear weapons is a deterrent?
They should only dearm if they can trust the nuclear umbrella of another country, which would be the United States. And I would argue that under Donald Trump, you can't trust the United States anymore. You can't untrust your security to the US. And even if Trump goes and a Democrat or someone that's more internationalist comes back in, there is always a risk that at the next election, a Trump-like figure will be elected. So unfortunately, we're headed into a world where we're likely to see a new rush of nuclear proliferation. And you'll see countries around the world harbor for nuclear weapons. So if Iran manages to get a nuclear weapon, then Saudi Arabia, the arch rival, will say, well, we also need a nuclear weapon as a deterrent against Iranian aggression. Otherwise, Iran will do what it wants in the Middle East. And
Yeah.
this is like a game of dominoes. Other countries will say, well, if Saudi Arabia and Iran have nuclear weapons now, why don't I have one? Right? I mean, there is even talks that Poland could acquire nuclear weapons as a deterrent against Russian aggression or Russian invasion. And then it's again and again and again, more countries get on the merry-round, and the world gets even more dangerous as a result.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I'm once again trying to get across. Maybe today's show, I'm not really putting all the pieces together like I wanted to, or like at least I have in my head, is that freedom and democracy is critical to the preservation of the world, not just because of who we get to vote for. We always talk about in a free society, we get electoral choices, we get to speak our mind, to do all that kind of stuff. But we need to deal with the more serious issues that those countries that are free and democratic, you know, with nuclear stockpiles, there's a good chance that they're not going to be used. But if the world is consumed by more authoritarian leaders, the chance of a nuclear war increases, I would think, 100-fold. Would you agree with that?
Very much so. The all the danger that we haven't mentioned at all is a rise of super intelligence and artificial intelligence. Now, throw that into the mix with nuclear weapons, and maybe someday, you know, nuclear weapon system can be hacked, and AI will take control, and that whole other kettle of disaster. There are just too many risks for us not to do anything and blindly accept that we have nuclear weapons and we should let it be. There needs to be, again, this is where leaders like Macron or even like Stormer can make a difference. There needs to be a renewed talk for nuclear security. Maybe it doesn't start with getting rid of nuclear weapons, of course, but it can start with trying to do new international treaties with all the nuclear powers to proliferate a bit less, to put some guardrails in place, to get back to that system that we had during the Cold War.
Well, listen, when I was younger, there was a movie with Matthew Broderick called War Games, where AI basically took over and threatened a nuclear strike. And I remember in Ukraine, I was in a meeting with the president of Ukraine, and there was a gentleman in there talking about how he wants to create AI exactly like that in order to manage wars. And you're right, when there's no emotional aspect to waging war, then of course they're going to launch nuclear weapons, and it's going to be holocaust around the world. I mean, it's global destruction. So, this is where we just really have to think long and hard about who our leaders are around the world, who controls these, and we, America, the UK, France, and others must do everything in their power to stop other countries from developing nuclear weapons. We cannot allow Saudi Arabia to have the weapons. We must keep Iran from having weapons. We must find a way to stop North Korea from having, even more weapons. It is nuclear proliferation, I think, is something that is scary, and is something that's going to be, I think, the next global war, which I do believe we're heading to World War III, very easily could be a nuclear war if we're not careful. Listen, Theo, it's great for you to be here. I'm just very, for those people who watch the show, I'm very, very sober today as far as just what's going on, because, I see, as much as I want to complain about Macron and complain about the French government, for my own personal reasons, French fries versus fresh fries or whatever we want to talk. The reality is, people like Macron, who believe in freedom and democracy, and who has stood by Ukraine, and who has stood up against authoritarian regimes, no matter how they may have their own personal foibles, they are the type of leaders that we need in the world. We cannot afford for freedom and democracy in France, for example, to go away. Anyway, thanks, Theo, for being here, and I'd love to have you back again soon to talk about these things. So, thank you. Um, Thanks for being here with Dane Waters and Around the World with Dane Waters. Let's take a break until next Tuesday, and we'll continue talking about these important issues next week. Thank you.